morning or good afternoon to all the participants. We're expecting a fairly large number. And so please allow us a minute or two to ensure that the participants have dialed in. So thank you for your patience. We will begin momentarily. Thank you. So why don't we begin? Let me welcome you all to our webinar, Retail's Route to Net Zero Emissions. Thank you all for joining. We were somewhat taken aback by the number of people who've registered, and obviously delighted that you can join us. And hopefully this will be one in a series of many webinars as we discuss this important issue. Let me begin so that we can hopefully stay on schedule. Let me begin by introducing our guest presenters and speakers today. Just prior to doing so, though, I'd like to make a few opening remarks. One is to remind everyone that there is a Q&A option on this webinar screen, and we encourage you throughout the presentations to pose your questions. We will try as best we can after all of the presentations to answer as many questions as possible, but you don't need to wait until the end of all the presentations. So please do so. If in fact you feel that you'd like the presenters to go deeper in some areas that will be discussed, again, those comments are appreciated. And finally, as the association representing the retail sector in Canada, we're obviously delighted and honored to be with you and to be among some great speakers this morning. We encourage you as we start building many programs to support the retail community towards the route to net zero emissions. And if you have any suggestions, any ideas on initiatives that Retail Council with partners should undertake, please put those also in the Q&A box. We look forward to your comments. You should know that RCC just recently hired a full-time vice president of sustainability, and our vice president works with the team at RCC, the team of experts in sustainability, as well as in other areas to support the industry. So he, as well as I, look forward to your comments. So thank you, and let's have a great webinar. So let me introduce our guest speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Janis Sarra. Dr. Sarra is professor of law at Peter A. Allard School of Law, University of British Columbia, and principal co-investigator of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. She was the founding director of the National Center for Business Law, associate dean of the Faculty of Law, and held the position of presidential distinguished professor of the University of British Columbia from 2014 to 2019. She was previously a commercial arbitrator and is a member in good standing of the Law Society of Ontario, Barreau de l'Ontario. Our next presenter will be Sophie Merritt. As the sustainability manager at one of Canada's biggest outdoor companies, Sophie spotted the opportunity to influence more than 200 outdoor brands to create system-wide change throughout the industry. Thanks to Merritt, MEC, formerly Mountain Equipment Co-op, launch ambitious, well, I shouldn't say thanks to merit. Here I go again with last names. Thanks to Sophie, and my apologies, Sophie. Sophie launched ambitious plans last spring with MEC. MEC's in-house label and all partner brands have aggressive new targets on sustainable materials, fair wages, and reducing waste to go circular. New climate targets are in the works. Prior to joining MEC, Sophie was a sustainability and plastics program manager at Oceanwise. She also held the position of corporate responsibility analyst at Aritzia. So welcome, Sophie. Last but not least, a colleague of mine, and I have the pleasure representing all of you retailers and the retail sector on the advisory board at the David Sobey Center for Innovation in Retailing and Services. And the man behind that incredible initiative is Ramesh Venkat, PhD. Ramesh is the director of the David Sobey Center for Innovation in Retailing and Services. He has over 20 years of executive and teaching and coaching experience. He's designed and taught graduate courses in brand management, CRM, and omni-channel retailing. He has been a full-time faculty member in the marketing department at St. Mary's University since 1992. So I welcome all our great speakers and presenters today, and I welcome all the participants. And again, I hope that you will share your thoughts with us and ask as many questions as you wish throughout the presentation. So let's begin, and let's invite Janis to present.
Thank you very much, Diane, and good morning, everyone. It's morning here on the Pacific Coast. I appreciate you attending, and I want to start off with two acknowledgements. The first is that the Canada Climate Law Initiative is honored to work on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples at the University of British Columbia, and to that end, we're very much committed in working in partnership between the private sector and Indigenous peoples. And secondly, I'd like to thank the many experts in the retail sector who gave us very sage advice on an earlier draft of this report. It's 67 pages and I have 10 minutes, so you can appreciate that I'll touch on some of the highlights that I see as important, but I encourage you to read the report and also to reach out if you have questions. The Canada Climate Law Initiative works generally in research and knowledge sharing in respect of effective climate governance. Next slide, please. As we all know, the retail sector is facing unprecedented challenges. At the same time, it's a very significant part of our economy, with annual revenues exceeding $636 billion. And what's interesting, of course, about the retail sector is, for everyone on this webinar, it doesn't matter if you're in the sector or in fact you're a consumer, we really care about retail and the route to net zero emissions. We appreciate that retailers have had to pivot during the pandemic to find very innovative ways to get their products to consumers with careful attention to safety of both employees and customers. And on top of that, now we have increasing urgency in respect of climate change. What's a little different about the retail sector than some of the other sectors in Canada is that 95% of its emissions are Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So they're the indirect emissions from purchased energy and in the value chain in terms of distribution and supply channels. Next. The physical risks, I think, probably don't need any introduction anymore, but let me just point out a few. Stores and warehouses are definitely being damaged and destroyed from acute climate-related events that are growing in frequency and intensity. That picture on the top is a stranded truck, during the November storms in the East Coast. Of course, in my end of the country, there were severe problems between wildfires, heat domes, and atmospheric rivers and flooding in recent months. And insurance costs are skyrocketing for businesses, including retailers. Floods alone, up until this past year, were causing an annual average losses of $1.2 billion, of which a sizable amount was not insured. In fact, the Insurance Bureau of Canada has now reported that the insured losses, so we haven't calculated that all of the losses, are well over 2 billion from last year's acute events. There are other risks as well in terms of, unavailability, uncertainty in terms of availability of raw materials, particularly agricultural materials or sources for clothing, and obviously disruption of goods and services. Next slide. There's also a series of transition risks. And again, the guide spends a fair bit of time on these. I can only touch on it briefly. Obviously, there are policy risks in the sense that there are changing policies, not only at the federal level in terms of carbon pricing and our commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, but there are different kinds of provincial regulation on and municipal regulation on everything from zoning to land use. There are technological changes. And so what you see is the shift to online has really created different kinds of challenges for climate-related risks. In terms of the markets, investors are clearly shifting their capital to companies that are more sustainable, and that's both their debt financing of the retail sector and also their investment in equities. Reputationally, we know there's growing consumer demand to be more effective in terms of waste management, use of single-use plastics, and of course, developing ethical supply chains. And the guide also talks a lot about some of the legal risks in terms of both the duties of retailers in respect of climate change in Canada, and then some of the risks around potential greenwashing and other suits. In the US, for example, there are more than 25 active lawsuits on greenwashing. In other words, representations of being sustainable where companies are not. Next slide. So the duties of directors and officers of retailers are the same as any company in Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence on this has been very consistent for 20 years now. There's a duty to act in good faith and exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in the circumstances. And that really directors should be reflecting on the interests of the company, but thinking about it as an economic actor and a good corporate citizen. And of course, since there's no denying now that climate risk is both material and urgent. We've heard this from governments, from the broad consensus in the scientific community, and of course now the courts. Directors have a duty to identify and manage these risks. The safeguard is that provided they're duly diligent and the decisions are taken within a range of reasonableness for the information we currently have available, then courts will defer and not find directors personally liable or companies liable. Next. There are so many opportunities, and I think this is one of the reasons for doing this webinar today, and many examples were gathered for the guide. But there's no question that generations that have increased purchase powers are speaking with their retail dollars. There are a number of empirical studies cited in the guide that talk about not only wanting sustainable, environmentally responsible products, but these consumers are willing to pay a premium for brands that do that. The other, I think, huge trend now is towards pre-owned or gently used products. And I think that is critical to successful pivoting in terms of climate change and carbon footprints. And then finally, retail experts tell us that a robust climate governance in place supports attracting and retaining the best and brightest of our employee workforce. Next slide. So there are a number of things I just want to touch on really briefly, but are explored in some depth in the guide. The first is retail stores, and it gives a number of examples of innovative strategies to reduce energy costs and to be more efficient, including a growing number of rooftop solar initiatives, rainwater harvesting for non-potable water uses, EV charging stations to encourage consumers that way, green leases where the kinds of information we need from scope 2 and 3, the indirect emissions, are actually negotiated into contracts to really assist figuring out where efficiencies can be made. And all of these need to be implemented in a way that really keeps retailers competitive and really think about where they can position themselves in a rapidly changing market. Next slide. And of course, e-commerce, a massive shift. There was already a massive shift underway when the pandemic hit. But of course, even the older people like me who'd never done any e-commerce shifted radically. But of course, what that's meant is a number of things. It was an increase in our carbon footprint from everything from packaging materials to, of course, delivery to homes instead of clustering at stores. But it also presents a lot of interesting opportunities. So for example, one study by MIT discussed in the guide is that replacing 80% of cardboard boxes, and I'm embarrassed to say that MHF is just boxes that have come into this house in the last month for e-commerce with paper bags can reduce 50% of emissions. And so another study by the National Retail Federation and IBM points out that retailers want choices. So if I have something urgent, the choice might be that I sacrifice some carbon points on this thing, but for most of the products that order, in fact, I'm willing to wait and do ground freight transportation. And so thinking about structuring sales in a way that allows consumers to be empowered in terms of the carbon footprint associated with retail shopping is going to be really significant. As are things like localized use and centralized locations, which deals with the last mile footprint for picking up packages, et cetera, and obviously bundling packages. Next slide. The same thing around supply chain management. I think there's significant emissions embodied in both upstream and downstream activities. I think that there are many new strategies to talk about how to reduce that footprint, how to bundle, for example, overseas shipments with other retailers, how to think about how freight is carried across the country on the major retail distribution routes, new kinds of collaboration between companies in this sector with a view to, yes, remaining competitive, but also appreciating that working together, they can reduce their carbon footprint. Consumers are increasingly screening for carbon emissions. And I think here, one of my strongest messages is be clear, and certainly I think take credit for the sustainable activities that a store is doing, that a retail outlet is doing, that a company, a food and beverage company, but it's really important to be accurate and not leave oneself open to charges of greenwashing or false advertising. The other thing that has been a significant emission reduction strategy is thinking about prioritizing lightweight packaging and also that huge amount of plastic that comes in terms of cushioning packaging. Next slide. New technologies offer so much, and the guide spends a fair bit of time. What I found really interesting in doing the study is this idea of mood shopping or shopping in micro moments. And I confess, sometimes I'm in a boring webinar and I go online and do some shopping, and I'm not of the generation that does this frequently. But there are new opportunities for integrated online and in-store technologies, everything from the way in which scans happen, new technologies that allow scanning of your body to more appropriately order online and thus reduce the number of returns. And there's a lot of deep thinking going on about how we can conceptualize retail shopping as a new cultural community hub that really advances sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide. There's growing talk about circular economic activities. And so we're moving from just recycling to really talking about reducing waste at the outset, really scaling up protection of biodiversity, accessing, sourcing materials as locally as possible, and really thinking about how we reuse and redeploy materials for others in society who may not have full access to new things or are very concerned about not over-generating everything from clothing to food waste, etc. Next slide. The good news is, for those in this sector, is that the tools and the guidance are increasing. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has created a very effective framework for identifying and managing climate-related risks, including looking at transition plans. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has several standards and guidance for different kinds of retailers in everything from food and beverage to apparel to multi-line retailers. Retail industry leaders are looking at, how one determines GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the greenhouse gas protocol. And of course, we're going to get a new international as of this year, Sustainability Standards Board, one of the offices located in Montreal. And all of these guidance are there. These are accessible tools and are just growing in number. Next slide. So what the guide does in the last sort of 5 pages is really tries to ask a number of questions to really guide retail boards as they start to talk to their managers and their employees, doing both sort of top-down guidance and also very, very much ground-up idea generating. And so it's divided into sort of 3 parts, which really looks at a number of things in terms of, what skills are necessary? Have we put the right resources? Are we going to take chances? Are we strategically planning with a view to government policy? What's anticipated? We know a lot of what's coming down the pike in terms of changes that we'll be forced to do, but I think the strategy is to actually leap ahead of that and be very creative in everything from risk management, governance, strategic planning. And then it gives some guidance on some of the reporting requirements, how they're changing now, and how to be ahead of the game so that climate never ends up being a key audit matter as you're trying to get your financial statements in order. So next slide. So just by way of conclusion, please read the guide. There's the links for it in both French and English. We work with 67 Canadian climate governance experts who are in every sector of the country and are lawyers, accountants, economists, and capital markets experts. And 67 of them have agreed to give free board presentations for the next 2 years to try and get boards started. These are in camera and confidential. So there's the link for that if you're interested, but it's in all of our interests to be prepared and to move forward on this. And thank you so much for your participation, and thank you in advance to my co-panelists who have generously given their time. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. And when you're referring to boards, I suspect you're also referring to executive teams. So the C-suite.
Absolutely.
So both boards and the C-suite.
Yes.
Thank you. And I see there are questions, so we encourage the participants to post as many questions, and please feel comfortable to do so. And now we have, it's my pleasure to introduce or reintroduce Sophie. And Sophie, you're on.
Awesome. Thank you, Diane. So hi, everyone. I am Sophie Merritt, the Sustainability Manager for Mountain Equipment. Today, we're just going to go through some of the high level of what MEC has been working on, obviously within the 10-minute frame. So I could take a whole day, but I'm going to take 10 minutes of your time here and kind of dive in. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go through at a high level, when we say sustainability department at MEC, what does that actually mean? Because I think sometimes that can be a bit gray. So if you could click, thanks. So the first piece of what we do is around product stewardship. So this is design, materials, consumer use, end of use. So how do we, use more sustainable materials? How do we design for end of life? How do we keep products in life as long as we can with high quality materials, different, product finishes, etc. Next. Then there is the social impact piece of what we do. So this is human rights, workplace safety, fair trade programs, that sort of thing. So really, how are we working with our partners that are actually producing these products? Then there's environmental impact, and this is around energy, water, chemistry, waste. So how do we reduce our footprint at an operational level as well? Next. So also not in the direct line of my department, but cross-functionally touching my department is outdoor impact. So this is our volunteer programs, donations, sponsorship, collaboration. How do we work with other, community organizations in Canada to get people active and outside? Next slide. So I really like to open up the conversation with this slide. Arguably, I overuse it. This is a study done by Protect Our Winters, which is one of our outdoor impact partners. and it's called Losing Our Cool. And what this was is they looked at ski seasons over across Canada for the next 80 years, and how is climate change impacting those regions. So I'm going to take the most dramatic example, Craigley, which is in Ontario. As you can see right now, the ski season there is over 100 days. But they're predicting by 2080 that it's less than 25 days. So I think this really shows like a very quick snapshot on how is climate change affecting our ability to get people active and outside, which is our main purpose and mission at Mountain Equipment. So I think when we have the sustainability conversation and the climate conversation, we're talking a lot about how this impacts our lives. We can see, with heat waves, like Janice kind of alluded to, we've had floods, heat waves, a bunch of different events across Canada and North America, the world, that impact people's daily lives, people's ability to do the things that they want to do, etc. But we haven't talked about as much about how climate change is directly affecting business. And so I think this really illustrates for us, if MEC's purpose is to get people active and outside in this region, for example, that is going to climate change is going to directly impact our ability to achieve our mission and our purpose as a retailer. And not only is it going to impact our ability to achieve our purpose, but it's also going to dramatically affect our business from a sales perspective. A huge category for us is, snowshoe ski winter gear as a Canadian retailer. And if you're looking at this example, we're going to have to really pivot and start thinking about other ways in which people can get active and outside. And it was actually really interesting. I don't like to think this way, but someone internally said, should we be planning for this? Like, based on the trends, should we actually be planning, like what does getting active and outside in the winter look like for Canadians in 50 years? I hope personally that I can still ski and enjoy the mountains in all their glory, covered in snow, because it's truly one of my passions. But it is something to start thinking about, like how is this going to shift? And for us, it's okay, if we want people active and outside, climate change is in direct conflict for that to happen. So it has to be part of our business strategy. Next slide. So then we go to, okay, if we have to address carbon and we have to address climate change, let's look at a product life cycle and figure out, where are the biggest opportunities for us to engage. So we talk about this piece between there's where can we influence? So what do we not have direct control over? So as you can see, the biggest opportunities from a carbon reduction perspective are at the beginning and the end of life of a product, in the yarn production, in the fiber production, yarn production, and fabric production. And then at the end of life with consumer use and disposal. So how do we engage in that, knowing that we can't directly influence, like once the product is in a person's hands, how can we make it easier for them to execute on the more sustainable option? And same with, how do we produce products with fiber production, yarn production, etc., that have the most minimal footprint? And then next. And then we have this piece around direct control. And so although it's smaller, it is what we can directly influence. So we also have to address that. So that would be our retail and distribution. Next slide. So looking at this, we went, okay, where are big opportunities? Beginning of life, which is around product. So we launched targets. This is targets in the graph there. This is targets for this year. But essentially, we decided it's critical for us to have a commitment towards sustainability with products that reduce our footprint, are built to last, and made at a fair price for all. So we essentially outlined a bunch of targets, both for our MEC label team, our in-house brand, and for brand partners. Next slide. And then we also have what is within our direct control. And so we were looking at carbon, circularity, and packaging. So one of the things MEC has done a really great job of is being a retail leader in green buildings. So we had the first and second retail stores in Canada, Winnipeg and Ottawa, to comply with Natural Resource Canada's C20 green building standard that acknowledges buildings that achieve 50% reduction in energy consumption over conventional structures. And many of our buildings are also designed with various levels of LEED, platinum, gold, and silver. Next slide, please. So just to kind of call out some of these features, Janis did a good job of sharing some of the opportunities as well. We have a mix of owned and leased buildings. So some of our stores are refurbished spaces, like the former Heritage Hotel in Victoria, and others are built new, which allows us to incorporate sustainability into the design from the ground up. So some of the things we've done are LED lights, motion sensors to turn off lights in unoccupied spaces, sawtooth roofs to and high windows to let in as much daylight as possible. And then we've used certain energy efficient features around heating and cooling as well. So geo-exchange systems in the concrete, floor slabs to provide radiant heating and cooling, ventilation that uses natural conduction currents and prevailing winds to maintain temperature and air quality, insulation that's above the standard, and on-site energy generation like solar panels on a few of our stores. Next slide, please. And then we are looking also at, so we talked about what we have influence and direct control over. So this is also the conversation around end of life and product. So we have a few things around circularity and packaging. So we have a 92% diversion rate. We use sushi roll packaging. So instead of using poly bags, we roll them and put a tie, which has decreased over 15 million plastic poly bags out of the landfill. And then we have gear swap, repair, and rental programs. So this is all about how can we maximize the use of our gear and lengthen its useful life as much as possible. And so basically right now, those have been done in a less systematic way where we can get as many people involved. So these were things that we closed during the pandemic, and we're relaunching them this year to be bigger and better than ever. So we look forward to you looking out for our new gear swap and our rental and repair programs coming soon. So thank you so much. Next slide, please. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you having me on here, and I'm more than happy to dive into any of these topics if you're looking for more really clear, granular advice.
Thank you, Sophie. And we have a few more questions in the Q&A box. So thank you to the participants for adding your questions. And so that we do have time to answer them, I'm going to invite Ramesh now to join us and provide some insights as well. Ramesh, and after your presentation, we will go to the Q&A part of the webinar. Thanks, Ramesh.
Thank you, Deanne. Thank you, Janis, for this opportunity. Next slide, please. Yeah, so, when you think about, what's driving all of this activity within the retail sector, there are three broad drivers, and Janis referred to some of them. The consumer is a key driver. Survey after survey is showing that people are now not just, thinking positively about, their approach to environment, but they're willing to actually spend, and they're willing to actually change their behavior. I mean, in the past, there used to be an attitude behavior gap with respect to what people said versus what they did regarding, the environment. But now that gap is narrowing, and we are starting to see that, particularly with the younger people, with the millennials. And the same folks are getting into the job market, and their attitudes are coming through there as well. Their expectations of their employers are very similar to their expectations from the brands and retailers that they engage with. So job seekers, especially the younger folks, want to work for companies that are sustainable. And then on the investor side, we are seeing the principles for responsible investment. Back in 2018, there were over 1,700 investment companies representing over $81 trillion in assets under management, pledging to incorporate ESG into their investment decisions, which means retail companies have to respond to those market pressures as well. So there are three broad factors. Next slide, please. So S&P puts out their risk atlas for different sectors, and for ESG, they rated retail as sort of moderate risk for both environment and social. But when you combine consumer products, transportation, and everything that is involved in the supply chain, retailers have a significant responsibility. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'll pick on two sectors. One is the grocery or the food sector. And here, as we know, there's a significant problem with food wastage. About a third of all food produced in the world is wasted. In Canada, it accounts for almost $50 billion annually. That's about 3% of GDP. I mean, just think about that number. And 13% of that waste happens within retail stores, which directly impacts the retailer's bottom line. And so there's a lot at stake here for retail companies in the food sector. Next slide, please. And in the apparel sector, over the past few decades, fast fashion has become the thing that everybody loves because these products are cheap. You can have lots of them, but at the same time, that comes at a significant cost. People now are buying way more than what they used to years ago, and then they're keeping them for way less time. And as a result, landfills are filling up. Next slide, please. And then more, recent times, after this pandemic started, there have been numerous studies looking at consumer attitudes and behavior. And we've actually done a series of surveys with Canadians over the past couple of years. And we are finding results very similar to what BCG has reported here. People have become much more conscious of the environmental impact of human action, and they are actually very concerned and willing to do something about it. So definitely, from a consumer perspective, the timing is right for companies to engage in action. Next slide, please. And in the past 2 years, as more and more e-commerce, e-commerce has just sort of gone through the roof. And again, there's a downside to that. 30 to 40% of all online orders are returned. And about 30% of all those products that are returned end up in landfills. And there's always a debate about whether stores are better or e-commerce is better from an environmental standpoint. I've seen results on both sides, depending on what assumptions you make. But the problem with returns is a pretty significant one. Next slide, please. So a lot of the reasons for returns tend to be controllable factors where the retailer can actually do things to minimize the returns with more attention to detail, more use of analytics, and better processes and so on. Those controllable factors can be addressed and you can reduce returns, which means there's less going to landfills. So there's some opportunity there for some proactive response. Next slide, please. And then, of course, retailers are, doing all kinds of things to address the last mile problem that Janis referred to. You're seeing these lockers popping up in various places. And returns are being handled in different ways, where Amazon now says you return to a nearest store, and that does reduce some of the carbon impact that's involved in the returns. Next slide, please. So overall, sort of looking at response from retailers, there's good and bad news. I mean, the MEC example that we just saw was amazing. That's a great example of a company that's very proactive. And then there's others that are, just getting started and they have a long way to go. If you wouldn't mind, just skip to slide number 15, please. Yeah. So we see great examples of companies that are leading on sustainability. MEC, as we just saw, is a great example. There are other companies that are doing really well. Walmart, Aldi, IKEA, even H&M. These are all global companies that are doing extremely well. In Canada, Sobeys, Lululemon, Canadian Tire, in addition to MEC, have taken significant steps. But really the path forward, I think, must involve the very senior levels of retail companies. The CEO has to lead and boards have to be engaged. And Janis has a great initiative here with the presentations that she's offering to board members. So so those are great steps. Targets and goals are critical so that you can measure against industry standards. What gets measured gets managed, and so that's important. Collaboration with suppliers is going to be critical going forward if you're going to end up with a green supply chain. And analytics and AI can play a huge role here. There's a great example of a German retailer, Auto Group, who uses analytics for ordering product at the right time, at the right quantity, so that they don't have out of stock and they minimize returns. The AI is able to order based on customer demand, so the possibility of returns are minimized. So technology can play a significant role here with respect to the initiatives forward. So the next slide, please. So I think that it has to move from a CSR domain to a more of a strategic CSR domain where these initiatives are linked to the company's competitive advantage. So it's not seen as some initiatives that are on the side, but initiatives that are central to the future of the organization, and it's linked to the competitive advantage. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here, and then if there are questions, I'd be happy to come back and share some of my insights from the other slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank you all for trying to provide a lot of information in very little time. But we also wanted to make sure that those who've registered for the webinar, that the slide decks will be available to all of you. And so let me now go to the questions. I'll ask my first question to Sophie, if you don't mind, Sophie. And I'd ask all of our speakers to try to be as concise as possible so we can get as many questions answered. Sophie, the question is, have you formally developed a sustainable procurement policy to screen suppliers on ESG issues? If so, how have you engaged? Whoops, they're moving. I think they just took the question away here. Just hold on. I don't know what's happening here. So I'm just going to ask whomever has taken it off should not have taken it off. Have you formally developed a sustainable procurement policy to screen suppliers on ESG issues? If so, have you engaged with suppliers on products, materials in which you don't have direct control? What learnings can you share?
Yeah, so from this question, so yes, we have a product policy that all of our brands. So I answer this in two parts. So I guess there's factories and manufacturers, and then there's like brand partners, right? Like the big brands that you would see in mountain equipment. So we have procurement policies for both around specific code of conducts, human rights related issues, but also product sustainability. And I would say, so learnings from it, for our own supply chain. So for our own mountain equipment label, we do further due diligence in our supply chain. But then for brand partners, we work with them in tandem to be like, how, where are you at? Where can we collaborate? What are opportunities? And then there are, also the hard stop things where it's like, we will not bring this into our store if it is XYZ. And that's certain material types. We have different, chemical requirements. We have different materials. So around cotton, for example, we're very strict around the cotton that ends up in MEC. And then also human rights related pieces. So for us as a retailer, it's a bit of an easier position because we're saying, hey, these are the requirements if you want to sell in our store. But it's also very collaborative and it's very partnership based. So it's like, hey, we moved away from this and we moved to a more sustainable alternative. This is how we did it. Like showing the story. I mean, we've done that with sushi roll packaging too, with a lot of other brands. It's like, hey, here's our case study on how we implemented it, and sharing that to others so that they can do the same. So we have this really unique position, and I didn't talk a lot about it, but as a retailer, we have this influence for not just our own supply chain, but another 200 supply chains. So really leaning into that, and we set targets for our brand partners as well around sustainability because of that, because it's a big elephant in the room. If we're doing, if our in-house brand that's 30% is doing amazing things, but we're not, working collaboratively with our brand partners, then that's not really a cohesive commitment. Yeah. So if there's any more questions on that specific question, but yes, we have a policy for both, and we engage in them both from a collaborative partnership perspective.
Thank you, Sophie. I have a question for Janis. On one of your slides, you mentioned product labeling, assuming this would include carbon footprints of products sold. Have you seen this in other jurisdictions? And how do you see this being implemented?
So yes, it is being implemented in parts of the European Union already, and is just beginning in some of the Asia Pacific countries. So I do think this is kind of one of the next waves. Just as people scan products now for meat or gluten or other things, that there's that kind of scanning happening. So it's how it's going to happen. I think it's going to start with the sector itself. I think it's going to understand that there are opportunities and positive opportunities for actually disclosing the sustainability of the products. But I do think eventually there may be some regulation as well, not unlike smoking said, this may be, you can still sell your tobacco, but it may be harmful to your health. It may be harmful to the planet. And there's no question, the Canada Competition Bureau has issued some guidance now under all of the labeling and other acts that it monitors to talk about, what's appropriate labeling and what's appropriate advertising and what isn't. And so there's some, a readily available guidance now on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Janis. This is I think a question for you, Janis, but Sophie may want to jump in, or Ramesh, but it's how do you secure shipping without damaging goods with paper bags instead of cardboard for e-commerce? So anybody have advice here?
Well, I'll start, and then I hope Sophie, because I know that MEC has put a lot of time and energy into this. I mean, there are a number of things, but part of it is that gathering of shipments, so that what you're not doing is individually packaging everything, but rather, clothing is obviously an easy example because it's non-breakable, et cetera, layering, bundling sushi packaging, et cetera. But just to really think through carefully what the product is that's being shipped, whether it can be bundled, and then broken down more at the sort of either last mile delivery or regional delivery. And I think another one, not quite on point, but does reduce the carbon footprint, is that we now see some retailers out of Asia, for example, who are monitoring the market and have figured out through AI, exactly the day and a half it takes you between your consumer research and your click to go back and actually move products in bulk to the region, reducing packaging and reducing all of that, and then distribute it as it becomes a reality, as people actually click and order it, which I found pretty fascinating. Sophie?
Yeah, so I think what it comes down to is testing as well. We've had, so for the upstream, it's been relatively quite simple, honestly. We still have a master poly bag in the shipments, but the reduction of plastic is crazy, a crazy amount for that one instead of having individual. And then from the last mile piece, you know, very small cases. So right now we're actually working on zero plastic packaging for e-com. And so the paper mailer is like the obvious next step. And there's very few cases of damaged product, like marginal compared to, you know, what the worry would be. And really the only case would be like heavy rainfall that day, like crazy sideways rain. And it's really about, you know, connecting with your teams at your distribution centers and looking at the different, you know, product assortments that could end up being shipped and what makes sense to go in where, and doing some testing around that. And that's what we're working on. I also wanted to mention I might be in trouble, I might butcher the name, but it's Responsible Packaging Movement. Prana has been the leader in this, and they are working on solutions from a packaging perspective. So if you're looking for resources, that would be a great place to go. So that's kind of my call out. And I just wanted to quickly, on the sustainable packaging piece, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, on the labeling, like the actual environmental regulation, like this is how much carbon, water, et cetera, this product uses. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition has built tools to measure products' footprint, and it is a requirement of members to be disclosing this, I believe, by 2025. So we're going to see a lot more of that in the future.
So I'm going to ask Sophie again, and unfortunately I'm going to ask you to be really short and sweet, but this is a tough question. Is there a chance you can dive into your materiality process for determining business impact? And if so, do you take a qualitative or quantitative approach? Not an easy question.
Yeah, so essentially we kind of like that life cycle carbon impacts across that we showed. There's a lot of data externally around, like if you're a retailer, where are your biggest impacts. But that is just at a quick glance, it shows you it's really, you know, fiber material production from a carbon, like an actual quantitative carbon perspective. And that's how we've gone about it. We're relaunching sustainability carbon targets, but really it's centered around, okay, where's the biggest impact and how can we, and like bang for buck, right? 80-20. If we're gonna move the needle, it's gonna be on sustainable materials. It's gonna be on keeping products in useful life longest. That's really, at the end of the day, how we're gonna decrease carbon emissions. The piece of, you know, as a retailer, it's important to reduce our footprint at a store level as well. But really where the meat of the issue is upstream and downstream. And then I would say for our retail stores and operations, we are using intensity based. So it is, you know, we're looking at based on the energy use, the type of energy in those stores. So if it's renewable or non-renewable, we want to be actioning the non-renewable stores as much as possible as the first priority.
Thank you. That's well done for a fairly complex topic. This is for all the panelists, so I'll let you jump very quickly in. How do you determine material issues for a retailer? And how do you define impacts to the business and importance of its to its stakeholders as well? How often should those topics be visited? Anybody want to jump in very quickly? How do you determine material issues? Sophie, you've kind of responded to that. Janice, you want to add?
I'll jump in, although I'm trying to give Ramesh a chance to get in here as well. So materiality is a critically important question, and my short answer is twofold. The first is that if the retailer is publicly traded, materiality has a particular meaning, which is it something that would be important to investors in making a decision, whether to invest, exit, etc. But materiality is much bigger for retailers because the consumer piece, they're very consumer facing. And what's important to consumers about all of these issues is incredibly important then to the retailers' ability to sustain itself. And so it really is a matter of doing a number of strategies to identify who the key stakeholders are of the business and what's important to them, and then to embed that in the strategic planning and risk management of the company.
And I'll just add to the question by saying, especially on how often should those topics be visited. We can tell you that in surveys that we've done with the larger retailers, because they in many cases are a bit more advanced, this has now become part of the reports to the C-suite. This is regular. So it's not like once a year that you're revisiting, but in fact, it's built into the strategic plan. The goals are very concrete, measurable goals, and they are part of the reporting at senior management. And I've heard more and more now that the progress made against those goals, good or bad, are reported back to employees to engage them. And like Sophie said, in many cases, the challenges they face, they share with their vendor community and their partners for learning. Because all the retailers, as Sophie has noted, and I know Ramesh has kind of talked about that in his presentation as well, the partnership is key. So I'm going to close with one more question, and I will give that one to Ramesh, but we'll certainly encourage others to join in. I'm a local manufacturer. What recommendations do you have for us to reach out to smaller retailers to collaborate on sustainability? They typically don't have as much resources as larger chain retailers, and typically everyone looks to supply chain. But if the supply chain are making adjustments and providing options, but retailers are not as open to applying the resources change, how do we move forward? Ramesh, you've worked with a lot of different small to mid-sized retailers. Is there any advice or anything that pops up that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think, resources are always a challenge, when it comes to small retailers, but, I also see a lot of innovation happening in that sector. For instance, this year, our annual innovation awards, we gave the awards to a retailer that's actually designing and offering products that are fully circular, right? And so the products are made from recycled plastic bottles, and it's 100% recyclable. Everything is recyclable, right? So smaller retailers, I think, have the potential to be nimble and be more creative. It's a lot harder to kind of steer these big ships, the big multinationals, but the smaller ones have, I think, a lot of potential to be nimble, and we see a lot of creativity happening. So I would encourage, if you're a manufacturer, to go and find the retailers that have a open mind and willingness to innovate and to change. And we've come across quite a number of them.
And I will add to that, Ramesh, that for smaller retailers, for this vendor asking the question, going back to what Janice and Sophie have said, is also using case studies, showing them what other retailers of their size are doing, does help them kind of make that project a bit more concrete. And as we've also often said, for small to mid-sized retailers, it's microbites. You're not asked to boil the ocean. It's take on this incredibly important challenge one bite at a time, learn from it, work closely. So if the vendor can bring that thinking to the smaller retailer, I think that they will find that they're much more open to collaborate and to move forward. Well, I see that it's 12:59 and we've not been able to answer all the questions, and I do apologize. But again, if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Retail Council of Canada or any of our esteemed speakers. We would be happy to share. We will share the presentation, and if no one on the screen minds, we'll share our contact information as well, because it is all about sharing. And I can tell you, our large retailers and our small retailers who are now engaged, as well as our vendor community, are very willing to share best practices. So just reach out. And you should also know in closing that RCC is moving forward with a multi-stakeholder committee looking at bringing suppliers and retailers together, as well as experts, to start developing best practices and case studies to help everyone. So on behalf of all the participants, I want to thank Janice, Sophie, and Ramesh. You guys have been great. It's a difficult topic. It's difficult to go really, really deep because we're trying to cover everything. And Janice, you are to be congratulated for the work you've done. This is definitely a roadmap, and we look forward to working with you as we go forward on this journey. So thank you all so very much, and thank you to all the participants. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Merci tout le monde.